one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Obviously, that greatly transforms it because it wasn't a command beforehand.
People are sleeping on this. This is what we see. Every single time you find this kind of a break in a manuscript, it only means one thing. It's always the same thing. One of the things that frustrates me as a scholar is that the Dead Sea Scrolls can potentially say whatever you want them to say about the Bible by every metric. 1Q Isaiah A is not word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
I am enthralled by history. Always have been, always will be. And what gets me the most are those rare moments when the past reaches out and taps us on the shoulder. The Dead Sea Scrolls represent exactly one of those moments, and by the gods, what a moment it was. It's 1947, and a young Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed Dib is searching for a stray goat in the Qumran caves near the Dead Sea. Frustrated, he throws a stone into a cave opening, expecting to hear the clatter of rock against rock. Instead, he hears the distinct sound of breaking pottery. That sound, that single accidental moment, would trigger one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. What Muhammad had stumbled upon were ancient scrolls, carefully wrapped in linen and hidden away in clay jars. But these weren't just any old scrolls, these were documents that would eventually push our understanding of Jewish and Christian texts back by nearly a millennium. Now, if it's not already clear, this is the kind of stuff that gets me very, very excited. Because what we found in those caves wasn't just old paper with ancient writing on it. What we found was a window into a world we thought was lost to history. We found biblical texts, yes, but we also found commentaries, apocalyptic prophecies, and texts that didn't make it into any canon. For instance, the Temple Scroll, which not only describes a temple so massive it would make modern megachurches look like garden sheds, but it is written in the first person as if from Yahweh himself, a stunning claim of divine authority that's unmatched in biblical texts. Some scholars believe that this may have been intended as a parallel Torah in its own right, carrying equal weight with what we now know to be the biblical version. We also found the War Scroll that details an apocalyptic battle between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness, the kind of stuff that would make most modern Christians choke on the communal wine. We found evidence of a vibrant, complex, and sometimes contradictory religious community that existed right around the time that Christianity was emerging. And the scrolls themselves are a marvel of preservation, hidden away in the dry, stable environment of the Qumran caves. These documents survived while countless others were lost to time. We're talking about texts written on parchment and papyrus, with the earliest potentially dating to the late 3rd century BCE, though most scholars place them in the early 2nd century BCE and later. And yet, there they were, waiting to be discovered, waiting to challenge our understanding of how ancient religious texts were transmitted and preserved. But here's the thing about remarkable discoveries that impact religions. They tend to become battlegrounds. Every fragment, every variation, every similarity becomes ammunition in theological wars. And that's exactly what we're seeing with the Dead Sea Scrolls. What should be celebrated as a fascinating window into how texts evolved over time, yes, with remarkable similarities that speak to careful transmission, but also with differences that reveal the beautiful complexity of textual development, has instead become fodder for oversimplified claims about perfect preservation.
It was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
And honestly, that's a tragedy, not just for scholarship, but for Christianity itself. Because when apologists overplay similarities and sweep differences under the rug, they're not just misleading people, they are robbing their own tradition of its rich and fascinating history. So, on that note, let's look at what Wes Huff had to say about the Dead Sea Scrolls on Joe Rogan's podcast, because it perfectly demonstrates this problem.
How similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So that one is fascinating. So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars Like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Let's break this down, because there's quite a lot happening in this short exchange, and it's absolutely fascinating. Not for the reasons that Wes thinks, but for what it reveals about apologetic rhetoric. First, notice how Wes builds his case. He starts with a qualifier. This isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Which sounds appropriately scholarly and measured. It's the kind of caveat that makes you think, oh, this person is being careful with their claims.
But one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Think about what word for word identical actually means. It means that if you laid these texts side by side, every single word would match perfectly. No additions, nothing taken away, no changes. They would be exactly the same. Emphasized 3 times.
Word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Every letter, every spelling, every small detail would be exactly the same. It's a claim of perfect preservation across 1,000 years, an almost miraculous claim, we could say. Almost as if God himself was acting to preserve it.
When you're saying that the book of, was it the book of Isaiah?
Yeah.
That the same book is exactly the same as, like, that's a miracle.
The problem is that that's just not true. The cool thing, however, is that there is some amazing things to be said about modern Bibles that relate to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And to give you just a taster of the brilliance that is the Dead Sea Scrolls, I reached out to biblical scholar and expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls, Dr. Kipp Davis, for commentary.
The wow that went round the world.
The wow that went round the world, indeed.
Word for word. Word for word.
Well, Dr. Kipp Davis, good sir, I know who you are.
Good to see you.
Because you've very kindly given me much of your time. But for the sake of everyone who's watching, who are you and what do you know about the great Isaiah scroll?
My name is Kipp Davis. I have a YouTube channel where I publish content on raising awareness of critical biblical scholarship. My training is in the Hebrew Bible, early Judaism, and with a special focus on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I have some experience with the manuscript that Joe Rogan and Wes Huff are talking about, because when I was a new PhD student back in 2005, I worked for Professor Peter Flint. I had a 3-year research fellowship working for him, and he is one of the editors of 1Q Isaiah A and 1Q Isaiah B, the 2 scrolls of Isaiah from Qumran Cave 1. So I have worked extensively on this manuscript. In fact, in January 2005, I spent, I think it was about 10 days in the city of Jerusalem with Professor Flint, as well as Professor Eugene Ulrich, his co-editor, inside the vault at the Shrine of the Book.
Wow.
For anybody who's been to the Israel Museum and gone into the Shrine of the Book, there is on display a copy of the Great Isaiah Scroll, 1Q Isaiah A. That is a replica. And the reason for that is because light and humidity are the worst things possible for ancient manuscripts. So the originals are kept in the dark, in the very, very dry dark. They don't put these things on display very often. And if they do, they're really sporadic, and there's special conditions for displaying them. And even under those conditions, the scrolls themselves are deteriorating rapidly. It's actually a little bit alarming, but that's a tangent I won't go on. So there's a replica of the Isaiah scroll on permanent display in the rotunda at the Israel Museum. Across the courtyard from the Shrine of the Book is the actual vault. The walls of the vaults are, like a meter thick, and that's where the actual Great Isaiah scroll is housed. I spent the better part of a week, maybe I think it was a total of 7 or 8 days inside the vault, working with Professors Peter Flint and Eugene Ulrich on the Great Isaiah scroll. And in fact, you can look around. I actually think I have a clip on my channel. It's one of the early videos I uploaded when I started my channel. So there was a Canadian television show back in the day called The Naked Archaeologist that was hosted, written, and produced by Sasha Yakubovici. And he happened to be in Jerusalem at the time. Professors Flint and Ulrich and I were working on the Great Isaiah Scroll. So he came in to the vault with his camera crew and spent 30 minutes interviewing Professors Ulrich and Flint. If you track down that footage, you'll actually see me floating around awkwardly in the background while they talk about this manuscript. So I say that to say that I know a thing or two about the Great Isaiah Scroll.
Indeed. And we're lucky to have you on, man, because one of the things that Joe Rogan mentioned in the podcast with Wes Huff is that true experts, you can wake them up at 4 a.m. and just give them a little slap on the face and ask them a real hard question, and they know it because this is their job. This is what they do.
The things that I am an expert on, you could wake me up at 4 o'clock in the morning and ask me about those things. And I go, oh, yeah, no,
Yeah.
this is what it is.
And you're that guy when it comes to this.
Well, it's not 4 a.m, but I'm here and I'm ready, Stephen. And I think I'm happy you brought that up because I think it's important to point this out as well. This was like one of the first questions. This was the sort of the entry into this conversation that Joe Rogan had with Wes Huff, waking up at 4 a.m, talking to me about anything that I know really well, and I can do it like that. Supposedly, this is what Wes Huff was supposed to be able to do in this context. And I've got to say, I don't think he did a great job. And I know the excuses. It's Joe Rogan. It's the largest platform in the world. Everyone's going to be nervous and excited. And I've never been on Joe Rogan, but I've been on some pretty big platforms before. I've been on the national news a couple times before. The nerves, the butterflies are there, but even through all that, I still know what I'm talking about, and I don't make the kinds of mistakes that Wes made in his interview with Joe Rogan.
Especially when it was clarified 3 times over, which we're going to get to. Like that is where your excuses really do run out. It's half an hour into the conversation and you clarify it 3 times over. That's where it gets tricky.
Word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
When Wes repeats that scholars say that we literally push back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years, what does he mean by that?
Now, I only noticed this. I've watched this clip probably 30 or 40 times by now, but this is something new that I'm picking up, seeing it with you, Stephen, that I hadn't really keyed in on before. When he says that our earliest copy of Isaiah was from 1000 AD, which is basically what he's saying. This requires a lot more nuance because I think that provides the impression to people that we really had nothing but, manuscripts that date 1,000 years later than the time of Jesus, right?
Yes, it does, yeah.
That's kind of the impression that people get, but that's not entirely true. So what Wes probably means to say, I hope, and the way that I would say this is that our earliest Hebrew manuscripts prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls dated to 1000 AD, thereabouts. Now there's a handful of smaller witnesses, something like the Nash papyrus is a very early copy, probably 2nd century BC, of text from Exodus and Deuteronomy. We have a couple of smaller fragments floating around. There's a few small fragments of Hebrew text at the library at the University of Manchester that predate 1000 BC, and I'm fairly sure these were acquired by the University of Manchester prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But even insofar as just a text like Isaiah, prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we still had things like Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, which are written in Greek, but preserve complete copies, right?
Mhm.
Ancient copies, ancient translations of the book of Isaiah. We also have quotations in the New Testament from the book of Isaiah in manuscripts that date back, to the 4th, maybe the 3rd century AD, right? The situation is a little bit different than that. I worry that people come away with the impression, right, that there's just this vacuum of information of 1,000 years that exists, and that's just not the case.
Well, that's the impression that I got. It's the impression that Joe seemed to have. It's the impression that a lot of Christians I've spoken to have got, and that is that wow, we had nothing for 1,000 years, and then it's word for word. That's almost miraculous, if you get the drift.
Is exactly the same as that's a miracle.
Yeah, exactly. So I think people could be left with the impression that for up until 1947, when the Great Isaiah Scroll was discovered, scholars just sat in this vacuum of not knowing anything about what the text of Isaiah looked like prior to the Leningrad Codex in the 10th century. And that's just not the case. And when 1Q Isaiah A was discovered, it was certainly very exciting. The discovery itself was very exciting and very surprising to scholars, but when they looked at this particular copy of the book of Isaiah, I don't know that anybody was shocked to see how close it was to the Masoretic text. I doubt that was what shocked scholars, if they were shocked at all. I think there's probably other features in the manuscript, and we can talk a little bit about some of those, which provided them more surprise. Just off the top of my head, maybe the most surprising thing of the book, of this copy of Isaiah that comes from Cave 1, that likely would have made an early impression on the first scholars who saw it, was the dramatically different system of spelling or orthography that's at work in the manuscript. It uses longer forms of words than we're accustomed to from the Masoretic text. It uses different long forms of pronouns that appear at the ends of Hebrew verbs or Hebrew nouns. So I think at a glance, this is probably what surprised scholars at first. But now, we've had 70 years to pore over this manuscript, and we've learned an awful lot beyond that.
Would it have been the condition in which they were that would have been greatly surprising, and the amount as well?
I should have said that too. I think that's the other thing. The fact that, and let's be clear, 1Q Isaiah A is a remarkable specimen. The fact that this is a plus 2,000-year-old, I tend to date it to about 100 BCE as to when this particular copy was written. But the fact that it is virtually completely intact, every word that was inscribed on this manuscript is still there. That's the remarkable thing, right? The fact that it's all intact, it's all complete. If you've ever seen any of the other Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll come to really, really appreciate how special this is, because the vast majority of them are just tiny, tiny little fragments. Some of them, a little bit bigger, but lots and lots and lots of fragments. And to his credit, I do think this is part of the point that Wes is really trying to make, because when he talks about the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the things he says is that there's tens of thousands of fragments. Most of them are like confetti, right?
Yeah.
Just these tiny little bits. And that's one of the things that Dead Sea Scrolls scholars have been doing for the last 70 years, is sorting through these tens of thousands of little pieces of the largest and the worst jigsaw puzzle on the planet Earth. And the reason why is because it's not just one jigsaw puzzle. It's like 900 jigsaw puzzles that have been all mixed together. And then half of the pieces have been removed, and we lost the box top, which tells us where they all go. So,
And all in a language that's difficult.
multiple languages, because we have some texts in Hebrew, some in Aramaic, and both Hebrew and Aramaic are pretty similar to one another. So we actually have a whole bunch of fragments that scholars are still debating whether it's even Hebrew or Aramaic, just because we don't have enough information on a particular fragment to say one way or the other. And then there are a small handful of fragments written in Greek, and a tiny handful written in another language that was the precursor of Syriac, I believe, called Nabatean.
So we know that Cave 1 Q Isaiah A is not word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Correct.
But what can you tell us about the similarities and the differences?
So, and I think this is important to point out, because there's been a lot of apologists working very hard to rehabilitate this statement made by Wes, to make it sound like something reasonable. I would say that by every metric, 1Q Isaiah A is not word for word identical to the Masoretic text. There's just no way you can make a statement like this in good faith. So, yes, let's start with the similarities. The text of 1Q Isaiah A is very close through most of it to the Masoretic text. And what we mean by that, this is the consonantal text that was used by the medieval scribal group known as the Masoretes in compiling their version of the Torah or the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. This has become the standard version of the Hebrew Bible. At the time when the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, between, the 2nd century BC to the 1st century CE or AD, there was no standard Hebrew text. There were different versions of Hebrew text. We know of a few of them, the Masoretic text being one. It was certainly, or something that looked extremely close to it, was in circulation at the time. We also know of competing versions that looked very close to what appears in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible called the Septuagint. We also know of, for the Torah, the Pentateuch, of another competing version that was preserved by the Samaritan Jewish community up north, closer to the Galilee, called the Samaritan Jewish community. So they preserved a form of the text that we know as the Samaritan Pentateuch. What the Dead Sea Scrolls have done, however, for our understanding of textual criticism is it's really expanded our grasp of these categories. We've come to see that they're not as fixed as we once thought they were. There's a lot of interplay between them. It looks like there could be even more versions of the Hebrew Bible that we just didn't know of before this discovery. So, yes, 1Q Isaiah A is close to the Masoretic text. I would say if you're just counting the individual words, then it's probably identical in the range between 90 to 95% of the total text. But there's a 10% point of variation there. And these are differences in individual words. Most of them are pretty minor, but there are a handful that are actually quite significant.
One thing that apologists emphasize when it comes to minor changes is that sometimes minor changes make a very significant difference. And they're right, they do. Like just a few differences in a few words can completely change the connotation. And yet, this same point, which is normally their bread and butter, being emphasized in this situation, has been written off as pedantic as if like they don't understand that there's a big difference between saying something is similar and something is identical, and then emphasizing that it's identical 3 times over. I see that to be the biggest issue really here, and it's wrong for them to, and including Wes actually, to hand wave this off as some kind of pedantic point. It's not pedantic, and they wouldn't recognize it as pedantic if the shoe was on the other foot. Is that your takeaway from this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And importantly, text critics don't recognize this as pedantic, right? Like, this is a whole field of work called textual criticism, and this is what text critics do. And if we're just going to insist that all the differences between manuscripts are pedantic or tedious, then what is even the point of going into this evaluative comparative taxonomical process? It's kind of insulting to the entire discipline. Do you want to look at one of these, what I would consider a significant difference?
I would love to.
This has been brought up a few times. When it has been brought up, I don't think people have carefully worked through this text enough. I'm drawing this from this book by Eugene Ulrich, The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Developmental Composition of the Bible. He's written a whole chapter on 1Q Isaiah A. And here he provides a couple of paragraphs of discussion of what is usually forwarded as the most significant or the most recognizable large variant, what he calls an isolated insertion into the text of into the Masoretic text. Now, importantly, what we're going to look at here is a text in the Masoretic text that is absent from 1Q Isaiah A. It also appears in the Septuagint, and it's absent from 1Q Isaiah A. And the scholarly consensus about this particular reading is that 1Q Isaiah A shows, it demonstrates that this is something that was added by a scribe at a later point in time. So this is after the composition of at least the copy that 1Q Isaiah A was working off of, right? This is already editorial change to the text that's occurring, what, 2nd century, 3rd century BCE? We don't know. But, not that long before the time of Jesus or the time that this text was written. So who knows when the addition actually occurred? We don't. And I think that's kind of the exciting thing here. So I'll read this. This is from Isaiah chapter 2, verses 9 through 11. So I'm going to read to you first what appears in 1Q Isaiah A. And this is Ulrich's translation. So humankind is humbled and everyone brought low. The haughty eyes of humankind will be brought low, and human pride will be humbled. Yahweh alone will be exalted on that day. Now, before we move on to the addition made by the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, let's think just for a second about what's happening in this text and what this is about.
Yep.
This is about the last days, right? This is Isaiah projecting forward to a time at the end when he imagines that Yahweh is going to come and basically settle the scales. The oppressed will be uplifted, the haughty will be brought low, everything will be set on a level playing field, the enemies of God will be defeated, and the righteous will be vindicated. Right? He says here, humankind is humbled, everyone's brought low, Yahweh alone will be exalted on that day. So right in the middle here, between these two parallel clauses, a scribe in the Masoretic tradition has added this: do not forgive them. Enter into the rock, hide in the dust from the terror of Yahweh and from the glory of his majesty. Now, I'm going to ask you, Stephen, does that make a difference
Yes.
to what this text is saying?
Yes, it does, yeah.
Right?
it transforms it significantly. And again, Christians recognize this when it comes to other verses. They would focus on little bits like this because they absolutely, and they're right, they absolutely do have relevance to our exegesis. And that right there is, in my opinion, depicting God as a lot more scary, and it's more of a threat, and it's more of a conquering that's coming through.
This is, forget the fact that this is 3 words. It's a total of 3 words in Hebrew, but this is an imperative. This is a command. This is an instruction. Do not forgive them.
Oh, yes.
That's added to the text. And that dramatically alters what's going on in this verse. So the reason why, because it's been suggested too, well, maybe this is actually the original reading and it fell out at some point along the way. This is almost universally rejected by scholars, mostly because the tendency within texts is towards expansion. Not always, but the tendency is towards expansion. And also the setting of a reading like this is more readily situated in a period of apocalyptic sort of persecution. It feels more post-exilic, maybe even Hellenistic, right? So that would be, sometime after 500 BCE or after 300 BCE is when this sort of thinking really starts to take hold in early Judaism. And importantly, this is a text that's featured in the first half of Isaiah, which scholars also tend to recognize was lots of this material can be traced back all the way to the 8th century. So this is clearly a later redactor, a later scribe, deciding that he needs to amp up this message a little bit on the basis of his apocalyptic rhetoric, deeply influenced by his circumstances, in the Babylonian or the Persian or the Hellenistic period.
So just to make sure I've really got what you said there, it's not just that you have words that change the connotation dramatically, you actually have a command that's been added. And obviously that greatly transforms it because it wasn't a command beforehand.
People are sleeping on this, right?
Yeah.
When Yahweh utters a command, I mean, I guess depending on how you want to understand this, and I would have to go and look and see what the commentators have to say about it. But whether this is Yahweh issuing a command to the reader, do not forgive them, or whether this is a plea on the part of the scribe to Yahweh, do not forgive them.
Yeah.
This is not the flex you think it is, right? Like, to suggest that this is just pedantic, these 3 words are just us being pedantic and nitpicky, no. This is powerful.
And even if it is actually applied, of course, not to the reader, but to some other peoples, you have this situation where once it could have been some poetic language of, order will triumph over chaos. But now, with the addition of this, that's not the case. This is a communication to some people. Most importantly, regarding Wes, this is an addition that's been added afterwards, which means it's not identical. It's just not identical. And to emphasize 3 times over that it's identical when you have something this significant, that to me is a problem. And I'd like to think that Christians would recognize that as a problem. When Wes and apologists in general oversell and make out that things are greater and more miraculous than they are, I think they're doing Christians over. Like, they're robbing them of their cultural heritage. It frustrates me.
No, I absolutely agree with you.
So what else can you tell us about the significance of Cave 1Q Isaiah A for our understanding of the Bible broadly?
So, and this is something I get frequently excited about, and it's the kind of thing that you don't really know about unless you're immersed in this literature, immersed in this material. This is something that Dead Sea Scrolls scholars are aware of, but for whatever reason, it doesn't get the kind of traction, even just outside of our little guild, into the broader field of biblical studies. It's Digital Dead Sea Scrolls, I believe, is the website. If you just punch that in. This is pretty cool. Look what happens when you drag it to the left. It scrolls.
Oh, cool. Wow.
So here you have every chapter and verse highlighted, right? But then like click and hold and drag it like your mouse to the right, sorry. Is that sweet?
Very, very cool. Oh, look at it. It's beautiful.
All right. So, a little bit of background here. What do you know about the composition of the book of Isaiah, Stephen? Do you know anything about it?
Not nearly enough, no.
The scholarly consensus on the book of Isaiah is that it's actually a composite of at least 3 separate books, and that it was written over a period of at least 200, 250, maybe 300 years. So when scholars talk about the book of Isaiah, they talk about 1st Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, and 3rd Isaiah. 1st Isaiah is material that scholars tend to think was, we can date more or less back to the 8th century, back to the time of Isaiah ben Amoz, Isaiah the son of Amos, who, served in the kingdoms of Ahaz and Hezekiah and Manasseh. So 1st Isaiah consists of everything from roughly from chapters 1 through to around the middle of the book. Commonly, scholars will say all the way up to chapter 39, but I think it's possible that 1st Isaiah proper might have ended earlier, maybe at the end of chapter 33, right in the middle of the book. And then 2nd Isaiah begins properly at chapter 40, and this is where the famous servant songs are, from chapter 40 all the way through to chapter 55. This is where Isaiah 53 is, the famous prophecy about Jesus. Importantly, this is also where Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia, is mentioned by name in Isaiah chapter, I believe it's chapter 49. It's either chapter 42 or 49. I don't know offhand. Very often, this is championed as an example of ridiculously accurate fulfilled prophecy.
Yeah.
If Isaiah's writing back in the 8th century and talking about the 6th century king of Persia, Cyrus, and names him, well, there you go. So, but this is one of these features of the text which have convinced scholars, well, no, obviously, this was written at a much later point in time. So 2nd Isaiah was not written in the 8th century. 2nd Isaiah was written during the Babylonian exile. It's temporally located, like just reading through the text, you can tell based on what the author is saying. One of the things that the author of this part of the book talks about is the fact that the temple is no longer standing. It's not there. Obviously, this is something that was written after the temple was destroyed. Mm-hmm. So after 586, 587 BCE, right? So that goes up to about chapter 55. And then the last 10 chapters of Isaiah, chapter 56 to 66, you see is probably another book altogether. The time is shifted again, further forward. Now, the second temple is standing. And the author of this part of the book, within his prophecy, speaks a great deal of all the nations coming into Jerusalem and worshiping in the temple of Yahweh, this new magnificent temple of Yahweh that's been constructed. So, scholars tend to think, well, this is obviously something that was written after 515 BCE when the second temple was built. This all makes pretty practical, pragmatic sense, yes?
Yeah. Referenced archaeology changing over the books.
Yeah. And you can track this through the text of Isaiah. One of the other things I'll mention here, which is important, that is in 1st Isaiah, Isaiah is actually mentioned by name in his prophecies 6 times, I believe. Virtually all the material after prophecies end in chapter 35, virtually everything beyond that, there's a little bit of prosaic narrative from chapter 36 to 39 featuring the prophet Isaiah. But then after that, everything is anonymous. The speaker is never identified. Isaiah is never identified. So the theory that scholars have had for a long time is that this book started as first Isaiah, Isaiah proper, prophecies uttered by Isaiah or attributed to Isaiah back in the 8th century. And then over time, additional material was included with this book. And I tend to think that most likely the original writers and the compilers of this book didn't even think that any of this supplemental stuff was prophecies of Isaiah. This was just them, including this literature on the same scroll because it sort of follows through on some of the same themes that appear in the book of Isaiah proper. So this is a book that has expanded and changed over hundreds of years. Now, here's what's really neat about 1Q Isaiah A. That's all background. Take a look here. What we're looking at, you've got it right in the middle of the page. Column 27 is chapter 33, Isaiah 33, the whole thing, all the way from verse 1 to 24. We're not highlighting any verses. We're just looking what's at the bottom of this column. What do you see here at the very bottom? Look at the other columns.
You're missing a gap. It seems to have finished.
That's actually 3 blank lines. Now, fortunately, because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are comprised of hundreds of manuscripts, we actually have a few manuscripts which contain transitions between individual biblical books, such as the transition from the book of Leviticus to the book of Numbers, or a transition from the book of Exodus to the book of Leviticus. And this is what we see. Every single time you find this kind of a break in a manuscript, it only means one thing. It's always the same thing. This means that this is the end of the book of Isaiah in the mind of the scribe who's writing this scroll. This is the end. Now, he's starting a new sheet. This is the stitching there on the between column 27 and column 28. So this is a new sheet. He's starting on a new sheet. He's starting at the top on a new column. In his mind, he's starting a new book. He's starting second Isaiah. I mean, as far as we're aware. So here, within this scroll, we actually have physical evidence for the first time of this theory that scholars have been, throwing around for 200 years now, but it's always been just theory. Now, we actually have evidence that scribes understood the book of Isaiah the way scholars understand the book of Isaiah. And I think this is huge. I think it's huge. Especially when factoring into consideration the ways in which Christian apologists want to marshal this sort of evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls, from 1Q Isaiah A, about the reliability of the Bible. When Joe Rogan has in his mind that his book of Isaiah in his modern Bible is identical to the great Isaiah scroll.
Fascinating things that I can't stop thinking about is how the book of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls was verbatim the same as the book of Isaiah that they found 1,000 years later.
Wow.
1,000 years.
Wow.
And it was exact, word for word.
Yeah.
Like, that's incredible.
He's not thinking that the book of Isaiah is actually comprised of multiple books written over hundreds of years, and yet that's what we see attested in this particular manuscript. And I'll say one more thing here of some significance. It's like staring me in the face. It might be difficult for you to see it, but on column 30 there, if you go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 lines. Okay, do you see this text in verse 6 through 8 there? you'll notice that it looks a little different from what surrounds it. Now, the reason for this is because when the original scribe...
Is it that it's squished?
Yes. And I can tell, too, looking at it, I can tell it's a different hand.
Yeah.
Like, it's not the same person writing this part. Now, what's happened here, Stephen, is the original scribe came up to the end of verse 5. So, right in verse 5 there, he left a gap of a couple of lines and then continued writing with the end of verse 9. So, and then another scribe has come along and filled in the missing text in the gap. It's weird. I mean, even from a, the perspective of an expert in the scrolls, this is a little strange. But this is what I would constitute a clear difference with the Masoretic text, with other types of text, what it shows us. And I think maybe we're asking some of the wrong questions here when we talk about variants in biblical manuscripts. One of the things we need to be thinking through is why the variant. What does this variant communicate to us about this particular manuscript, about the scribal process in transmitting these texts? So what's happening here, and I won't go into great depth, but basically scholars have now come to understand that for the second half of this book, this additional second, third Isaiah that's been appended onto this scroll, the scribe is actually copying from a different manuscript now. So he had one manuscript for first Isaiah, and he's done with that. Now he's got a new one, but this one that he's copying from, is actually damaged at the bottom. So there are times when he encounters the end of the end of a column, but it's damaged and it's broken and he can't quite see what's going on. So he knows, well, there's more here. I can't tell what's there. I'm just going to leave it blank, and maybe I'll come back later, or somebody can come back later and fill it in with the correct text. What's really interesting is he doesn't always do that. Sometimes he actually tries to fill in what he thinks the missing text is, and it comes out as like this, you can tell he has the gist in mind, but it's clearly different. It's a paraphrase. He's just thinking off the top of his head what this text means, right?
Yep.
So this is an exciting manuscript. There's a lot of exciting things going on in here. You may have noticed that there's all sorts of scribal insertions in the margins. You can see right in the middle there's letters kind of going down the margin between column 30 and 31. You can look over at the end of column 32. There's a whole bunch of text that's added in the margin there. This is an active template where scribes are jotting out their ideas, correcting errors, ensuring that the text is accurately transmitted, whatever they think that is. This particular manuscript, all of these manuscripts are testaments to the scribal process. One of the things that really bothers me about this interview that Wes gave to Joe Rogan, and then this discussion that's surrounded this whole thing, is the way in which we think about the Bible relative to the Masoretic text. There's this tendency to prioritize the Masoretic text as if this is the version. This is the one. This is the right text. Why? Why are we doing that? I mean, there's nothing within the Bible itself that indicates we should be using the Masoretic text as opposed to a different version like that in the Septuagint, or, when it comes to the Torah, that in the Samaritan Pentateuch. This idea, something that it's something that scholars did for a long time, was to think that the Masoretic text was somehow a special text, the right text, the standard text, the one that was probably the oldest text. Text critics don't think like that anymore. They don't talk like that anymore. We recognize now that the Bible, at the time when these texts started to be collected, rewritten, and put together, there were all sorts of different versions, competing versions. Some of them had different books in them. Some of them, had some pretty interesting additions and omissions to text that were shared between them.
When you had these people that had this theory, if you will, that the Masoretic text is the better one to go for, it's the more ancient one. When we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, this obviously was a big win for them, because although it's not identical, it's pretty close. Is that a fair interpretation?
Actually, I would say that this was the assumption at first, but over time, as we've looked at these manuscripts, Stephen, that has been completely overturned.
Oh, fascinating.
Because, remember, we don't just have the Great Isaiah Scroll here, and also remember, well, I should say, the Great Isaiah Scroll, when it's classified by scholars, is not classified as a Masoretic text. It's also not classified as a copy of a text like the Septuagint. Scholars tend to talk about this one as a non-aligned text, meaning it belongs to something different that we don't really recognize just because of the nature of the fluidity and the relationship between these versions. But one of the really exciting things is that within the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're talking about, 950 thereabouts individual scrolls, individual manuscripts. About 250 of those are texts of what we identify as the Bible. Among those biblical texts, we have copies which do not align with the Masoretic text, but actually align with the Septuagint, which do not align with the Masoretic text, but actually align with the Samaritan Pentateuch. Texts that don't look anything like any of the versions. So it's basically really upended the entire scholarly conversation about what the Bible looked like at the time of Jesus, and it's erased any thoughts at all that there was a standard version. Nobody talks like that anymore.
So earlier you were mentioning a theory about the book itself being comprised of 3 different books, and this was a theory that was going round, and it would make sense of some of the prophecies and whatnot. And it seems that when we discovered this scroll, and we could see these signs, very clear signs of them being 3 different books, that is a very big win for that theory. So not only does it make sense of the data in sense of it's just common sense, the easier way to make sense of it, but also you can see here actual tangible physical evidence of that happening.
What we want, right?
It surprises me that this isn't the thing that Wes said. Scholars were shocked to find that this theory that doesn't lend itself too well towards the Christian narrative, it got a really big plus in its favour, and that's had some impact on scholars and what they think about it. To me, that's a very shocking thing. That legit, you could say, yeah, scholars were shocked. Like, okay, the theory's got even more evidence in its favour. What more could you ask for? Would you say that's a fair interpretation of a theory getting some form of vindication from that discovery?
Absolutely. Like, this is how science is supposed to work, right? We develop hypotheses, we build models, and then we work from the evidence we have. Some of this is like in my opinion, this is just good science at work. I should say one other thing about this too, Stephen, because it's even more exciting than this. There are 21 copies of the book of Isaiah in the Qumran scrolls. 4. A total of 4. So 1Q Isaiah A, 1Q Isaiah B, 4Q Isaiah A, 4Q Isaiah C. And the 1Q, the 4Q, these are just the cave numbers where they were discovered. So these 4 manuscripts are complete copies of, Isaiah from chapter 1 to chapter 66. 1Q Isaiah A is the only intact copy. But from all the evidence of the surviving fragments, we're confident that these other 3 contain the entire book when, it was written.
Got you.
So that's 4. There's 17 additional copies. Every single one of these copies of the book of Isaiah preserves material either from only 1st Isaiah or only 2nd and 3rd Isaiah. And that is across the board.
and that would be more evidence of them being separate books.
Yes.
Damn.
Yeah.
See, like, all of this is robbed when none of this comes to the forefront, when we're told they're identical.
This is why experts matter, right? Because I have no doubt that Wes doesn't know any of this stuff. And that's fine, because he's not a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar. Most scholars who aren't working in the scrolls aren't aware of this kind of stuff. They don't read everything that the Dead Sea Scrolls scholars have written. And also, I don't think enough attention has been paid to some of these features. William Brownlee, who was my PhD supervisor's PhD supervisor, he actually wrote about this back in the 1950s. My PhD supervisor has written a couple of articles about this feature of the what he calls the bisection of Isaiah. You know, it's been written up in the official edition of this scroll, but you know, it's sometimes some of this stuff gets lost in the weeds. And it's tragic because, in my opinion, this is maybe some of the most exciting stuff when it comes to this manuscript, when it comes to my work.
Yeah, I just agree. Like, that's amazing. Well, all right. So the Great Isaiah Scroll is just one scroll, Dead Sea Scrolls. And I'm wondering, in what ways does the whole collection inform us about the Bible, about early Judaism, and about the beginnings of Christianity?
In so many ways, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls have completely revolutionized our understanding of early Judaism. For a long time, scholars had clear ideas about this monolith they thought of as Judaism that looked very much like the rabbinic Judaism that followed through the medieval period and into the modern age. We knew about the Sadducees and we knew about the Essenes as well as the Pharisees from writings by Philo and Josephus. But now with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're able to put a lot more flesh on these bones. We're able to see, you know, there's a lot of places where Josephus and Philo were not entirely accurate in their descriptions of early Judaism. I should say this, the Dead Sea Scrolls as a collection, this is a group of manuscripts that were collected by a group of Jews, by a group of Jewish people who look like they were probably most like the Essenes. But they also share a lot of similarities with the temple establishment, the elite in Jewish society. So, you know, there's a lot of again, the boundaries between a lot of these things tend to be pretty fuzzy. Everything tends to be a little bit nuanced. So this has really helped to dramatically change the way we think about early Judaism and early Christianity. One of the exciting things discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls is also a lot of overlap in the things that the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls liked, theology that they had, and stuff that you read in the epistles of Paul or in the Gospels. As I mentioned, the scrolls were written predominantly in Hebrew and Aramaic. They have revolutionized, they have dramatically changed our understanding of these languages insofar as the relationship between the Hebrew scrolls and the Aramaic scrolls. There's also some really interesting questions insofar as how these relate to one another theologically or politically. Like it's just a lot. It's a lot, Stephen. And I'll just say again, it's completely changed the game insofar as our understanding of the shape, the composition, the circulation of the text of the Hebrew Bible at the time of Jesus, in the years leading up to the Roman Empire and during the Roman imperial era. It has helped us to see, I think, in exciting ways, that during this entire time, the Bible, well, first of all, there was no Bible during this particular time. There were scrolls, scrolls that most Jews seem to have really liked a lot. Some of those scrolls that they really seem to have liked a lot are not ones that Christians or even Jews nowadays appreciate terribly. Books like First Enoch or the Book of Jubilees or the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs are things that, lots of people seem to have thought were really, really important books. But it's really changed the way that we think about the relationship of the texts of Scripture in what I would consider its developing form to the people who collected this stuff. And no, they were not fixated on differences between one version of the book of Jeremiah and another version of the book of Jeremiah. Clearly, the writers and the collectors of the Dead Sea Scrolls had lots of different types of text, lots of different versions of the same text, and they weren't bothered by it. They weren't fixated on making sure that everything was precise and accurate and letter by letter or jot and tittle kind of accuracy of preservation. They weren't hung up about a lot of the same things that Christians in particular seem to be hung up by now today when it comes to the text of the Bible.
You emphasized there that there were certain books, certain writings that these early scribes really cared about, which indicates that their culture was really caring about these pieces of text. And yet today, they're not regarded as important. I don't know the ins and outs, but maybe some of them haven't made it all the way through into like the Christian Bible.
Let me just say something else about that. I think too, I would assume, certainly when I'm working as a scholar, I would characterize the ways in which these ancient people cared about their scriptures in different ways than modern people do. One of the ways that I think shows to us the kind of concern and the care that they had for these texts was their willingness to provide extensive expansion or clarification to things that they thought were difficult. They would rewrite entire books in new ways to communicate what they considered to be really important about them. I'll mention another manuscript, and actually it's here on this same site. You've probably heard of this one. You talk about it in your introduction, the Temple Scroll, right?
Yes. Yeah.
This is an amazing text. It's the largest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's really, really long. There it is, the Temple Scroll.
That's incredible.
It's crazy. Parchment height is 24 to 26, length 814 centimeters, 8 meters long.
Wow.
Right? So this is the largest one. This is one that when I look at a manuscript like this, you might even be able to tell just scrolling through, but this is one that has been composed with considerable care. The copy itself is really damaged, but if you scroll forward to some of the better preserved material, you can see that the scribe who actually wrote this particular manuscript is very highly skilled.
Yeah.
He's very concerned and meticulous about the text. This communicates to me that the people who collected this particular scroll thought it was really, really important.
For sure.
By the way, the reason why that top edge is damaged and missing like that all the way across is because when this scroll was discovered back in 1956, it was handed off by the Bedouin to the antiquities dealer, Kando. His name is Iskander Khalil Shahin. It was handed off to Kando. He looked at it and said, "This is the mother lode. This is the prize. This is the crown jewel." So he decided he wasn't going to sell that to the archaeologists that he was working with. He was going to hold on to it for like a rainy day, and then figured it would be a good idea to stick it in a shoebox and put it under the floorboards in his house. I'm not kidding. This is true.
That's painful. That's so painful.
Yes. And it sat there.
Dude.
It sat there. 1956. It sat there for 11 years, Stephen.
Oh, that's so painful.
I know. It is. But I bring this scroll up just because it's exquisite. It's remarkable in its composition.
Yeah.
My interpretation of this is that this is a very, very important manuscript to these people. Is this a biblical manuscript? I mean, we don't know the answers to these sorts of questions, but I would suggest we may have some clues. As you mentioned, it's got this really, really elaborate description of a giant temple in the last days that was going to be built not by human hands in the new celestial city of Jerusalem. The other part of this text is basically a full rewriting of the entire book. Well, maybe not the entire, but huge portions of the biblical book of Deuteronomy. But an extensive rewriting where all sorts of things have been adapted, changed. There's material that's been added to it. There's stuff that's been taken out of it. When Yigel Yadin, who is the scholar who published the edition on this manuscript, when he first described this scroll, he called it a wild Pentateuch, just because of how dramatically different it was from anything anybody had ever seen. But one of the really wild things about this scroll is that it's written in the first person.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the speaker constantly identifying himself in the first person. And the speaker presumes to be Yahweh himself. So from the perspective of the reader, this is Yahweh's scroll that he wrote for y'all. And this is what Yahweh is telling you to do. Oh, you have questions about that? Well, look here in this scroll. Yahweh says, I want you to do this. Now, I'm asking you, Stephen, is that scripture?
The thing is that, again, if you want to say the scholars are surprised, you find this. It's the prized possession. They've obviously got their best scribe on it, and it's incredibly well preserved. And you have it so that this is God himself talking to you. Damn right you got to take this seriously. I mean, like, they take seriously when God gives other commands,
right?
Just here and there in some of the books. What about this? This is a book that does it itself. Like, but no, it doesn't resonate with contemporary Christianity. And so, come on, like, this is it. This is the one. Like, this is amazing.
Yeah, it is.
But it may not say what you want it to say.
Yeah, exactly.
Just before we move on, that pains me that was put in a fucking shoebox. My God.
Oh my God. I could tell you stories, man. The history of the discover, like the from the 40s up to the present day is a history all unto itself. That's actually, I've done quite a bit of work on the modern history as well. Written articles and things. And it's pretty, lots of things that happened are pretty insane and incredible. I'll just tell you this quickly. So, like, this all happened in 1947, right around the time that the British mandate for Palestine was ending, right? And if you know your history, the British mandate for Palestine ended, and right away, Israel declared itself an independent state. And then the surrounding nations declared war on Israel, right? This is all happening at once when the scrolls are being discovered. The original discovery was just 7 manuscripts. It was 1Q Isaiah, 1Q Isaiah B, the Genesis Apocryphon, the War Scroll, the commentary on the book of Habakkuk, and then that's 5, right? What am I missing? The Community Rule, and damn, I can't remember the 7th. Anyways, doesn't matter. It was these first 7 manuscripts. They got split up. So 3 of the manuscripts, 1Q Isaiah A, the Hodayot, that's the 7th one. So 1Q Isaiah A, the Community Rule, and the commentary on Habakkuk all ended up with this antiquities dealer with Kando, and then in the hands of scholars, right, of archaeologists. On the other side, the other 4 ended up with a man by the name of Eliezer Sukenik, who was a professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University. He heard about the find, right? He knew some people who knew some people. He managed, during this tumultuous time of upheaval, to get himself from Jerusalem to Bethlehem on a day pass going through like military checkpoints and things to go and look at the scrolls first. And then he actually went to buy these 4 manuscripts on behalf of his university. He's super nervous about transporting them back into Jerusalem from Bethlehem, right? He runs into his study in his house on Mount Scopus and sits down and starts poring over these scrolls. He's the first European basically to see this stuff in 2,000 years, right? In the meantime, one of his sons has the radio on in the background, and while he's sitting at his desk looking at the text of the Hodayot and reading it to himself, he's also listening in the background to the radio broadcast of the United Nations decision to establish the state of Israel. And he writes in his journal, he says, this moment of significance was celebrated in my home, one religious, one political. It's a remarkable story, but like, and it just kind of like there's so much about just like the discovery of the scrolls and
I love it.
You know, the politicization of this stuff, the relationship of the scrolls to the state of Israel, things that the state of Israel did in promoting their own solidarity and independence on the basis of what was in the scroll. It's I could go on and on, but I won't. I won't go on and on, but I could.
All right. Before I let you go, and I really appreciate your time, so thank you. You're the 4 a.m. guy. Get you up and you'll be able to answer all the questions. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, I hope I haven't disappointed, even though it's not 4 a.m.
There will be some upset Christians in the audience, I'm sure, but there'll be other Christians that are like, thank you.
Yes, I have no doubt. So, but you should know too that, well, I mean, once you get me talking about this kind of stuff, it's like I can't stop, right?
Exactly. And before I let you go, I'd like to get your thoughts on a few observations that I found with the exchange that we just saw from Wes and Joe. Mm-hmm. And so I want to play a couple of clips and then ask a few questions. So let's get to them.
Yeah, for sure.
So when you say the book of Isaiah is intact, how similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So, Kipp, I know that we've kind of covered this, but when Joe asks about the similarity of the Bible, he's clearly talking about modern translations like the King James Version or the New International Version. And yet, instead of addressing that, what Wes did is he pivoted to comparing it with the Masoretic text. And my question is, what do you make of this rhetorical move, be it deliberate on Wes's part or not? What do you make of this, and how different is the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Like, yeah, there's a couple. So in the first place, because the translators of the King James Version didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls in front of them, right away, in most of our modern English translations of the Bible, there are readings from the Dead Sea Scrolls which have now been incorporated into the text. So, you know, right there, it's not the same even as the Masoretic text, right? But then even, because that's not what, like when Wes mentions this correspondence to the Masoretic text, who knows if Joe Rogan even understands what that means or the significance of that. But I do think that it's easy to be misled if we're not careful and really nuanced with our language and when we're talking about these sorts of things. And the frustrating thing about this, and this is a problem I think all scholars have. Scholarship is hard. Like, this kind of stuff is hard. It's hard work. It's hard to correctly characterize and nuanced discussions, academic discussions that are ongoing about the manuscripts, about the text. I think this works in any field. Popularizers of science or scholarship are always, you know, under the gun for getting things wrong or you know, messing up what is actually taking place in, you know, current scholarship, like current science. And the reason for that is just because it's so difficult to reduce what amounts to decades of work for most people into a few sound bites.
Yep.
It's so hard for me, which is why my streams are like 3.5 hours long, right? I think I'll say that to start. The other thing, in terms of your question, the other thing I have to point out is this, that our modern Bibles are potentially very, very similar to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Our modern Bibles are potentially dramatically different. It all depends on which manuscript you are comparing your modern Bibles to, because there are lots of manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls which contain text of the Bible. And the proper way to approach this is not to treat them eclectically. Effectively, you could construct your own text of the Bible from just the manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls to look basically identical to the Masoretic text by just picking and choosing the things that you want from the manuscripts that you want, right? That's an eclectic edition. That's an eclectic version. But that's not the right way to approach this. We need to look at each individual manuscript in isolation. What is this manuscript copy? What is it doing? We did a little bit of that today, right? Just by comparing 1Q Isaiah A, the fairly it's a bit of a mongrel in terms of the scribal interaction in that manuscript, comparing that to something like the Temple Scroll, which is pretty magisterial, right? I asked you questions. We thought through the implications for what this means about the scribes, their texts, and what they're attempting to do. These are the sorts of things, these are the sorts of ways in which we should be approaching these manuscripts. When, I'm working with the 37 or 40 or so fragments of one of those K4 copies of the book of Isaiah that was only a copy of the second half of Isaiah, I need to think carefully about what this manuscript is. How big is it? How carefully copied is it? And I'm not just talking in terms of its relationship to an existing textual tradition. I'm talking how much care is the individual scribe putting into ensuring that it's clean and exact, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are there obvious errors in terms of spelling mistakes or, repetitions or omissions that we can demonstrate were not intentional? Like, are there those sorts of things in this manuscript? And what do we make of that? So, this is the proper way to approach these texts and to approach these questions. And so, for that reason, one of the things that frustrates me as a scholar is that the Dead Sea Scrolls can potentially say whatever you want them to say about the Bible. And this has certainly been marshaled by apologists to tell us that they provide so much strong confirmation to the stability and the reliability of the text of Scripture. Sure. But then on the other hand, they completely undermine all of that as well. We have to have this conversation on both sides of this. Yes.
Yeah, and that's what they don't focus on.
So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Very small clip, but this is something that I've noticed a lot with apologists. So Wes's rhetoric here, he starts with this careful, measured language. This isn't true of all the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what this actually does is it establishes him as someone who's speaking with an academic precision. He's being careful. He's being nuanced. But then, when he moved on, he made a sweeping claim of word-for-word identity without any such qualifications. And what I'm wondering is this a common apologetic technique that you've encountered? And what does it tell you about how we should evaluate his stronger claims?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if I've coined this term, but I have gotten in the habit of identifying some people as Schola-pologists. I probably haven't coined it, but I use it. Maybe I have, and if I have, then you're welcome. But you get what a schola-pologist is, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
A schola-pologist is a scholar who will take off his scholar hat and put on his apologetics hat and speak apologetically.
Mhm.
Now, here's the tricky thing. A schola-pologist can be a great scholar. I've known some. As an example, one of my mentors, one of the editors of the Great Isaiah Scroll was Peter W. Flint. He was an excellent scholar. He was also a very, very deeply devoted evangelical Christian. And I would, when I, worked for him, one of the things that he would do is go and give talks in local churches to Christian organizations. And his rhetoric in these settings was always quite different, right? From when he was giving a scholarly paper or, writing an article. So, I saw this firsthand, and I think that this sort of careful nuance followed up by an apologetic claim is something that you would probably see more commonly from a schola-pologist. And based on everything I have seen, I would put Wesley Huff firmly in that camp as well. His full-time job is working for, an apologetics organization. He's doing a PhD at the University of Toronto. He hasn't published anything yet, as near as I can tell. I'm interested. I'm eager to see what his scholarly output looks like, but so far there isn't any. You are picking up this maybe this subtle feature of speaking something with an appropriate level of scholarly caution, but then following that up with a bold claim. As an example, one of the things that Peter Flint used to do, there's a manuscript in now all the Dead Sea Scrolls are, when we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, usually it's the scrolls at Qumran, but there's other finds in the Judean desert. There was scrolls discovered at Mutabat and at Masada and Nachal Hever. One of the manuscripts discovered at Nachal Hever is a pretty large copy of the Book of Psalms that dates to the 2nd century, end of the first, beginning of the 2nd century AD. And in this particular copy of the Book of Psalms, it preserves, well, it's damaged. I have questions about it, but it seems to preserve a reading from Psalm 22 that aligns with the Christian interpretation of this is the crucifixion psalm, right? My God, why have you forsaken me? Lots of the crucifixion themes and images are drawn from this psalm. The dividing of Jesus's clothes among the Roman centurions, like that's out of the psalm. In one of the verses in the Masoretic text, it says, "Like a lion were my hands and my feet," but in the Septuagint translation of that, it says, "They pierced my hands and my feet." Crucifixion, right? Sure sounds like it. I won't get into the problems, but there's all sorts of problems with how we're going to understand this text, right? And here you have a manuscript that looks like it potentially preserves this ancient reading, known only from the Greek translation. When Peter Flint used to present this to church groups, he would build it up, right? And he would show the manuscript on the screen, and he would say things like, "My friends, there it is. They pierced my hands and feet."
And when you turn to the relevant verse, what do we find? There it is, ka'aru. They have pierced my hands and feet. I have just shared with you dynamite.
And I kid you not, Stephen, the room would erupt in applause. Praise Jesus. Amen. Hallelujah. This is the kind of thing that gets people excited. And, scholars will lean into that sort of thing. They can.
Yep, and it's a similar thing. You know, I've seen it in science a lot.
Yeah.
So like William Lane Craig with science and philosophy, you know, he will speak very carefully and with nuance around the areas around the periphery, and then the peripheral. And then when it comes to the big claims, which he will make very definitive statements that are just completely against the scholarly consensus, that are not backed at all, it's very hard for a layperson to be able to recognize what's going on. And if they are aware enough, they will be able to pay attention to go, this person looks legit. They are being very cautious. They are being very, very careful with their language. They're nuanced almost to the degree of it being annoying. And yet they're able to make this definitive statement. That must resonate. And that's my big problem with what Wes has done here. Like that's bad. And that is very, very, very common in apologetics.
And I think I agree. Here's the thing. I'm not convinced that it's always deliberate though either, right?
No, I don't think it is either.
I think it's a product of being raised within like an evangelistic culture.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to think that oftentimes when I'm teaching or when I'm presenting stuff that I will start to preach. I think it's a reflection of my upbringing, right? Having sat in churches for how many decades of my life and watching preachers doing a little bit of preaching myself in the early days, you know, it's a rhetorical style that I think you pick up.
This is going to show ignorance of me knowing your past, but am I right in recalling that when you started your scholarly work, when you started looking at this stuff, you were a religious individual, as is the case for a lot of people that study this stuff?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And importantly though, like I like to point out to people too, that I was still a religious person for a very long, long time after looking at this stuff too. And that most of my scholarly positions on things like the composition of the Bible, the history of Israel, the Gospels, you know, all of these sorts of questions, I've almost changed none of my positions from when I was, you know, a Christian doing scholarship. I think oftentimes that surprises people, but I like to remind people of that, because this is sort of the world that I work in, where most biblical scholars, they're Jews and Christians, because of course they are, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
But I think that's very difficult. I actually watched this on Ruslan had Dan on yesterday on his show, and this came up, and it's hard for people to understand this, but like there's a separation. You know, I would put on my scholar's hat when I went to work Monday to Friday, and I would put on my church hat when I went to church on Sunday. And like they're different hats.
Yeah, and so many people speak of this, and it makes sense, you know, like it makes sense in the sense that when you're doing the science, you're doing scientific work. You operate under the rubric of science. But faith ain't like that for most people.
Yeah. I really, really liked Stephen Jay Gould's definition of non-overlapping magisteria. Right? Like that was my whole thing for most of my academic life, right?
All right. So, Dr. Kipp, really appreciate it. It's been fascinating, especially being able to go through some of the scrolls with you. Lastly, where can my audience find you, and what are some of the cool projects that you're going to be working on now?
Yeah, for sure. So my YouTube channel is just my name, Kipp Davis. I do all sorts of different critical biblical scholarship. I make videos countering bad biblical scholarship, most of which happens to be Christian apologetics, but not all of it. I actually have a long form series all about the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not finished yet, but there's already 3.5 hours of material there spread across, I think, 10 or 11 videos, where if this is the kind of thing that interests you and you want to do a deep dive on this, Like, go check that out, because this is the kind of stuff that I cover in great depth and exacting detail in those videos. I also have a course on the religions of ancient Israel, their history, their development, and how the Bible got them so wrong. You can find that over at MVP Courses. And with regards to 1Q Isaiah A in particular, and this whole podcast situation with Wes Huff and Joe Rogan, I did a stream not that long ago all about this. You can, and I go into some of this stuff with the Great Isaiah Scroll and other aspects of scribal culture and the Dead Sea Scrolls in greater depth. So I think that's everything. I think that's me.
Yeah, so basically, if people want to learn more, and you should, this is your guy. Go check out his channel, check out his course if you're interested. Kipp, we really appreciate you. We appreciate you weighing in. A lot of scholars don't when it comes to apologetics, and I understand why. Just thank you. Really appreciate it. And until next time, my friend.
I will answer all your relevant questions if you call me at 4 a.m., but please do not call me at 4 a.m.
That's an invite.